In this lesson, we'll talk about the new posing tools and how we can use them to quickly deform and pose our Mudbox models. So we'll use our T-Rex as an example, and the pose tools can be found down here in our pose tools tray. We have 4 tools here: to create joint, pose, weights, and move pivot. To get started, we're going to use the create joint tool. All right, and let's say we're going to use this tail as an example. We're going to click and drag towards the end of the tail in this case, and a lot of things are going to happen. So we'll click and drag, and so you can see that we've placed our joint, and it's actually been placed kind of in the center of that volume of the tail. We also have a joint boundary, which is that green ring that will rotate around as we rotate. That's kind of where that influence happens. And then we have our joint vector that we can pull out or make shorter, and this is kind of going to affect the length of that fall off there. So if we pull this way out, we're going to get a very soft transition versus something a little bit more hard if we bring this in. So let's go ahead and just click out here, something like that. And so what that'll do is create that weighting. So you can see the green areas are going to be influenced the most, and then as it comes in here, it's going to fade into the body, and those are going to be influenced a little bit less. Okay, so that's going to be our weighting, or region of influence there. Now to actually pose this, we'll activate the pose tool, and now we can pose this using an off joint technique or an on joint. The functionality is going to be a little bit different based on what we do. So if we use our left mouse button and we just click and drag here in this region of influence, we can actually rotate this around that particular joint. So you can see that happening, and that's based on our view, so that if we come up here, we can actually rotate this side to side, or from an angle like this, rotate it in that angle. So however we're looking at this, we can rotate it in that way. Okay. We can also rotate this by clicking on the joint. So if we left mouse button on the joint itself, going up and down will cause it to twist in this way. Going left and right will cause it to move away from the camera towards the camera. Okay. And again, that's dependent on our view. All right. We can also move this by using our middle mouse button and clicking and dragging on this region of influence. We can move this tail around. We can also scale it, and we can do that by using our middle mouse button on the actual joint itself. So clicking and dragging on that will scale it. If we hold down shift, it'll actually constrain that scale. So this is useful if we find that maybe our tail is a little bit too big, we want to shrink it down a little bit, arms and legs, things like that. Useful for scaling pieces of our geometry, so not just for posing. All right. Now, this pose is currently in an uncommitted state. That is, we can go in, change the weighting on this, so getting our weights brush, maybe adding more weighting to this if we want to. We can control, click, and drag to remove weighting, and then you can see that the points will actually update because the pose has not been yet committed. Okay. We can also move the pivot around, but if we move the pivot, it's not going to update the rotation that we've already done, but it will allow us to rotate that around the new pivot. All right, so once we're done with this particular pose, and before we go on to the next, create the next joint, we're going to commit the pose. So to do that, we can click off on any of the, like a sculpt tool or paint tool, or we can click on the create joint tool to create a new joint, and that'll go ahead and commit that pose. All right, so we'll go ahead and commit the pose, and then we can use this tool to continue to modify some of this geometry. We'll use the tail as an example, and then maybe move up to the head. All right. Okay, so once that pose has been committed, we can now come in here, add another joint. Okay, come back in, maybe rotate that a little bit, move it up, go back in and commit that pose. Okay, do that again, create another joint there, again rotate that, maybe move it up a little bit. So you can really get in there and get a nice pose going. Go ahead and commit that. Now, one thing that we should talk about is posing multiple objects. So in many cases, you may have objects that you need to actually pose together. For instance, a character holding something in his hand, or in this case, our T-Rex has teeth that we need to move along with the head. So there is actually a way to do that. So let's go ahead and move up here. We'll use our create joint. Go ahead and drag this up towards the head to add some weighting to that head. And you can see that the teeth don't have any weighting right now. So thinking about this, they're not going to really go anywhere when we rotate that head. So all we need to do is go to the weights brush. I'm just going to dial the strength up, and we've got our mirror in the X on. And so what we can do is just go in and start to add weighting to those teeth. All right, so just add our weighting to the teeth, and that will allow us to actually rotate that when we pose the rest of our model, whatever else is kind of weighted there. Okay, so that adds it to that. And if we had the eyes as separate pieces, we could do that there as well. And then you can go in and rotate that around and move it around if you want, and you can see the teeth follow along. Now, one other thing to think about is how to work with our joint boundary. So this model presents us with some issues as far as the joint boundary and going in and posing some of the arms and legs because of how the geometry is built. They're not just kind of cylinders stuck onto the side where we can just kind of drag out along the joint. So we need to actually kind of pull out in a little bit of a different way with our joint. So let's say we want to pose up this arm. If we were to go ahead and just place this sort of in the middle of the arm where we want this and drag straight down the arm, you can see that the joint boundary is actually encompassing the rest of the model. So we're not really getting what we want. So in this case, we could place the joint in the same location, but instead of pulling straight down the arm, we actually pull out a little ways. So go ahead and pull this out until the joint boundary is just around the arm. You can pull that out. Then you can go ahead and kind of rotate that, move it around. Okay, go ahead and commit that. So that's just something to be aware of when you're working with arms and legs and appendages that come off in different ways. You may have to move that vector, pull that vector out in a particular direction to get that joint boundary going in the direction that you like. All right. Another thing that we can look at is actually adding poses on particular sculpt layers. So if we were to go ahead and add a new sculpt layer and then come in and let's say create a joint right along here, we've got this sculpt layer activated. We can come in here and let's say that we want to kind of take some of that weighting off. We could go ahead and using control kind of take that weighting off inside there. Okay, to add our pose, and we want to commit it, let's say on this layer. Can go ahead and hit create joint, and that will commit that pose to that particular layer so that if we turn that layer off, it's actually contained within that layer. So it may be a good way to store some different options if you want to go ahead and pose those options up in those layers, and then you can turn them off and on as well. Okay, another thing that we may want to do is to actually bring in a rigged model from Maya, and we can actually do that here in Mudbox. So let's go ahead and turn off the visibility on this guy, and feel free to experiment a little bit with the posing on your project file there. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn off the visibility here. And so what I want to do now is to just import an FBX, which is what's going to allow us to bring this model in. And this is just a low resolution mesh, and you'll find it in your project files, rex_rig.fbx. And we'll go ahead and bring that in. And this is just kind of a low-res version of our dinosaur. In Maya, that's bones have been added and weighting has been added. And it doesn't look much different now, but if we go ahead and go to our pose tools and choose pose, we can see there's now a skeleton inside of this. We can actually see the skeleton also in our object list. If we go down to the bottom, you can see skeleton, and then we can actually go in and look at all of the different joints here. But what's nice about this is we can just use our pose. We don't have to worry about creating joints. If the weighting has been done in Maya, we may not have to worry about weighting at all. Depending on, if you may need to adjust some of the weighting, you can do that. But we can go ahead and use our pose and just really quickly grab these joints and do all of our rotations here. So really quickly come in and pose up this model in Mudbox using the existing joints and weights. All right. Now, one thing we haven't touched on is, for instance, if I go ahead and select this foot, instead of rotating the foot, let's say that I want to rotate the rest of the model. It's really easy to do. We'll just hold down Control and rotate this. And all the rotation rules stay the same, but instead of rotating the foot, we're using Control to rotate that. The same thing applies here. Okay. Then we can come back in, kind of rotate this out, really quickly create a nice pose. Maybe rotate the tail up a bit. So having the skeleton here makes it really easy. Okay, coming in here to do that. Kind of pull that up. All right, so keep that in mind as well. And I believe there is a joint limit based on your graphics card. I think it's 256 for an NVIDIA card, 75 for ATI. So just keep that in mind when you're building, creating those joints and putting those in your character to bring into Mudbox. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of getting started with posing here in Mudbox. So have a little fun posing up your T-Rex model. In the next lesson, we're going to look at some of the ways that we can integrate Mudbox with Maya. So looking at some of the import-export functionality and also the new send to Maya functionality. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that next.